The neon lights of Murphy's Tavern cast a red glow across the crowded bar as Sarah Martinez walked through the heavy wooden doors. After 18 months deployed in Afghanistan, she was finally home in San Diego, trying to adjust to civilian life again. The noise hit her first, laughter, clinking glasses, and classic rock music blending into a wall of sound that made her instinctively scan for exits. Sarah had changed out of her uniform hours ago, trading military precision for worn jeans and a simple black t-shirt. At 5 feet 6 inches with an athletic build, she moved with quiet confidence, her dark hair pulled back in a ponytail. Most people in the bar saw just another young woman enjoying a night out. They had no idea they were looking at Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, one of the first women to complete Navy SEAL training. She found an empty spot at the far end of the bar, away from the crowd. The bartender, a friendly man in his 50s, approached with a welcoming smile. "What can I get you?" "Just a beer, please." "Whatever you have on tap." As she waited, Sarah's trained eyes continued their automatic assessment of her surroundings. 3 exits, including the main door and a back entrance near the restrooms. The crowd was mostly military personnel from the nearby base, mixed with locals. Everyone seemed relaxed, having a good time. The bartender returned with a cold beer, and Sarah took a grateful sip. The bitter taste was refreshing after the long flight home. She had been looking forward to this moment for months, just being normal, being anonymous, not having to be on every second of every day. "You military?" the bartender asked, polishing a glass. Sarah nodded. "Just got back." "Thank you for your service," he said simply, then moved on to other customers, respecting her obvious desire for quiet. For the first time in months, Sarah felt her shoulders relax slightly. No one was shooting at her. No one was depending on her to make life or death decisions. She could just sit here, drink her beer, and try to remember what normal felt like. 20 minutes passed peacefully. Sarah was starting to think about heading home when she noticed the commotion at a nearby table. A group of 4 men, clearly drunk, were getting louder and more aggressive. Their voices carried over the music as they made crude comments about the women in the bar. "Look at that blonde over there," one of them said, his words slurred. "Bet she'd be fun." Sarah's jaw tightened, but she stayed focused on her beer. This wasn't her fight. She was off duty, trying to decompress. Let someone else handle the drunk idiots. But the comments got worse. The men started rating women like they were judging livestock, their voices getting louder and more vulgar. Other patrons began to look uncomfortable, some women moving to different areas of the bar. The leader of the group was a big man, probably 6 feet 4 inches and well over 200 pounds. He had the build of someone who spent a lot of time in the gym but clearly thought his size made him untouchable. His name tag read Jenkins and showed he was Army, probably stationed at one of the local bases. Jenkins stood up unsteadily, his chair scraping against the floor. "I'm gonna go talk to some of these ladies," he announced to his friends, who laughed and encouraged him. Sarah watched in the mirror behind the bar as Jenkins approached a table where 2 young women were trying to enjoy their drinks. She could see their body language change immediately, shoulders hunching, leaning away from him, clear signs of discomfort. "Evening, ladies," Jenkins said, his voice loud enough for half the bar to hear. "Mind if I join you?" "Actually, we're having a private conversation," one of the women replied politely but firmly. Jenkins either didn't hear or didn't care. He pulled out a chair and sat down anyway. "Come on, don't be like that. I'm a soldier, I deserve some appreciation." The women exchanged worried glances. The bartender looked over, clearly debating whether to intervene. A few other patrons were watching but seemed reluctant to get involved with someone Jenkins' size. "Please leave us alone," the second woman said, her voice shakier now. "I'm not doing anything wrong," Jenkins replied, his tone turning nasty. "Just being friendly." "Unless you don't support the troops?" Sarah's hands tightened around her beer bottle. She had seen this before, men using their military service as an excuse to intimidate others, as if wearing a uniform gave them the right to make people uncomfortable. It made her sick. The situation escalated when Jenkins reached across the table and grabbed one of the women's wrists. Come on, dance with me. Let go of me, the woman said, trying to pull away. That was enough. Sarah set down her beer and stood up, her decision made. She had spent her entire military career proving she belonged in places where people said women didn't. She wasn't about to sit by and watch some drunk bully use his size to terrorize innocent people. As she walked toward the table, Sarah's training kicked in automatically. She assessed Jenkins' position, his balance, the positioning of his friends. Her movements were calm and controlled, drawing no attention from the crowd. Is there a problem here? Sarah asked, her voice carrying just enough authority to cut through the bar noise. Jenkins looked up at her with bleary, aggressive eyes. Mind your own business, sweetheart. This doesn't concern you. Actually, it does, Sarah replied calmly. You're making these ladies uncomfortable. I think it's time for you to go back to your table. Jenkins laughed, a harsh sound that made nearby conversations pause. You think you're gonna make me? You're what, maybe 130 pounds? I could break you in half. The two women used the distraction to quickly gather their things and move away. Sarah was glad they were safe, but now Jenkins' full attention was focused on her. Look at this, he called out to his friends. Little girl thinks she's tough. Sarah maintained her calm exterior, but internally she was calculating distances and angles. Jenkins was big, but he was also drunk and overconfident. Those were significant disadvantages, even against someone with his size advantage. I'm asking nicely, Sarah said. Go back to your friends, have some water, maybe call it a night. Jenkins stood up, using his height to try to intimidate her. Or what? You gonna call the cops? Maybe cry? The bar had gone quieter now, people sensing the tension. Sarah was aware of at least a dozen people watching, probably expecting to see her back down or run away. She wished she could just walk away, but Jenkins had moved between her and the exit, clearly not planning to let this go. Last chance, Sarah said quietly. Walk away. Jenkins' response was to reach out and grab her arm, his large hand wrapping around her bicep. Maybe you need to learn some respect, he said, his grip tightening. That was his first mistake. Sarah's training had taught her that once someone put hands on you, the rules changed completely. The moment Jenkins grabbed her arm, he had escalated from verbal harassment to physical assault. Sarah looked down at his hand on her arm, then back up at his face. Her expression was completely calm, almost bored. You sure you want to do this? She asked. Jenkins squeezed harder, probably expecting her to wince or cry out. Instead, Sarah just smiled slightly. Okay then, she said quietly. What happened next would be talked about in Murphy's Tavern for years to come. Sarah's movement was so fast that most people in the bar missed it entirely. One moment Jenkins was gripping her arm, sneering down at her with drunken confidence. The next moment he was on his knees, gasping for air, his arm twisted behind his back at an angle that suggested any struggle would result in a very painful dislocation. The transformation in Sarah was immediate and startling. Gone was the quiet woman who just wanted to drink her beer in peace. In her place stood someone who moved with deadly precision, every motion economical and purposeful. Her grip on Jenkins' arm was like a steel vise, and, despite his size advantage, he was completely helpless. Here's how this works, Sarah said conversationally, as if she was discussing the weather rather than restraining a man twice her size. You're going to apologize to those women you harassed. Then, you're going to leave this bar quietly. If you try anything stupid, I'm going to make sure you spend the next 6 months explaining to doctors why your shoulder doesn't work right anymore. Jenkins tried to surge upward, using his weight and strength to break free. Sarah simply adjusted her grip slightly, and he immediately stopped moving as pain shot through his arm and shoulder. That wasn't smart, she observed. Would you like to try again, or are we ready to have an adult conversation? The bar had gone completely silent now. Even the music seemed muted as everyone stared at the small woman who had just effortlessly neutralized someone who looked like he could bench press a small car. Jenkins' 3 friends were half standing, clearly wanting to help but unsure what they were seeing. You're military," Jenkins gasped out, finally, understanding that he had seriously miscalculated. "Very observant," Sarah replied dryly. "Now, about those apologies." But Jenkins' ego was too big to let this go, even with his arm twisted behind his back. "I don't know what kind of martial arts crap you learned, but this is just a lucky hold. If you let me up, I'll show you what real combat looks like." Sarah sighed. She had really hoped this could be resolved quietly. "You know, I tried to give you an easy way out of this. My buddies are about to teach you what happens when you mess with a real soldier," Jenkins snarled. Sarah glanced up at his three friends, who were indeed moving toward them now. They were all big men, all clearly military, and all obviously thinking they could intimidate one woman through sheer numbers. "Gentlemen," Sarah called out calmly, still maintaining her hold on Jenkins, "I strongly suggest you think very carefully about your next move." The biggest of the three, a man with sergeant stripes who was probably used to being the scariest person in any room, stepped forward. "Let him go, lady. You got lucky once, but now you're outnumbered." "Actually," said a new voice from across the bar, "I think the odds just changed." Sarah looked up to see Commander Patricia Walsh standing near the bar's entrance, still in her service khakis. Commander Walsh was Sarah's former instructor and one of the most respected officers in naval special warfare. She was a legend in her own right, and Sarah had no idea what she was doing here. "Ma'am," Sarah said respectfully, though she didn't release her hold on Jenkins. "Martinez," Commander Walsh replied with a slight smile. "Fancy meeting you here. Having trouble?" The three men advancing on Sarah stopped in their tracks, suddenly, uncertain. Commander Walsh might have been a woman in her 40s, but she carried herself with an authority that made even drunk soldiers reconsider their choices. "These gentlemen seem to have missed some lessons in basic courtesy," Sarah explained. Commander Walsh walked closer, her footsteps echoing in the quiet bar. "Is that so? Well, perhaps I can help with some education." She looked directly at Jenkins, who was still kneeling with his arms secured behind his back. "Soldier, what's your name and unit?" "I don't have to tell you anything," Jenkins replied belligerently. "You're not my commander." "Actually," Commander Walsh said, pulling out her phone, "I think I'll just call the base commander and let him sort this out. I'm sure Colonel Harrison would love to hear about his soldiers harassing civilians and starting fights in local establishments." The mention of Colonel Harrison had an immediate effect. Even in their drunken state, the four men recognized that name. Harrison was the base commander for the entire installation, and he had a reputation for coming down hard on soldiers who embarrassed the military in public. "Wait," one of Jenkins' friends said nervously. "Maybe we can work this out without involving anyone else." "Oh, I think it's too late for that," Commander Walsh replied. "You see, you gentlemen made a serious error in judgment tonight. You decided to harass innocent civilians, and then, you made the mistake of trying to intimidate someone who was far more qualified to handle this situation than you realized." She gestured toward Sarah. "Allow me to introduce Lieutenant Sarah Martinez. She recently returned from 18 months deployed with Naval Special Warfare Group 2. Lieutenant Martinez completed SEAL training with the first class that included women, graduating in the top 10% of her class." The blood drained from Jenkins' face. Even through his alcohol-induced haze, the word SEAL training penetrated his consciousness like a bucket of ice water. "That's right," Commander Walsh continued, clearly enjoying the effect her words were having. "You tried to intimidate and physically assault a Navy SEAL. How do you think that's working out for you?" The bar was so quiet now that Sarah could hear Jenkins' labored breathing. Around them, other patrons were pulling out their phones, some probably recording, others likely Googling to see if what they were hearing was actually possible. "Now," Sarah said pleasantly, "would you like to reconsider those apologies? Because I can keep you in this position all night, and I promise you it's only going to get more uncomfortable." Jenkins' resistance finally crumbled. Okay. I'm sorry. I'll apologize." Sarah carefully released her hold and stepped back, but remained ready to react if he tried anything else. Jenkins slowly got to his feet, rubbing his shoulder and looking thoroughly humiliated. The ladies you harass left already, Sarah pointed out. So you can start by apologizing to everyone in this bar for ruining their evening. Jenkins looked around at the crowd of faces staring at him with a mixture of disgust and fascination. His earlier bravado had completely evaporated, replaced by the dawning realization of just how badly he had misjudged the situation. I'm sorry, he said quietly. Louder, Commander Walsh ordered. And, with some sincerity. I'm sorry. Jenkins called out to the bar. I was drunk and stupid and I'm sorry for causing trouble. There was scattered applause from some of the patrons, though most people were still too stunned by what they had witnessed to react much. Good start, Sarah said. Now here's what's going to happen. You and your friends are going to leave quietly. You're going to call a cab or an Uber, not try to drive. And you're going to spend some time thinking about how your behavior tonight disrespected not just those women, but every person who wears a military uniform with honor. Jenkins nodded miserably. His three friends were already moving toward the exit, clearly wanting to get as far away from this situation as possible. And, Jenkins, Sarah added as he turned to leave. If I hear about you bothering anyone else, anywhere, we're going to have another conversation. And, next time, there won't be any witnesses to keep me from really showing you what I learned in my training. The threat was delivered in such a calm, matter-of-fact tone that it was somehow more terrifying than if she had shouted it. Jenkins nodded again and hurried after his friends, clutching his sore shoulder. As soon as they were gone, the bar erupted into conversation. Everyone was talking at once, trying to process what they had just seen. The bartender approached with a fresh beer for Sarah and a glass of wine for Commander Walsh. On the house, he said. Both of you. That was something else. Sarah accepted the beer gratefully and turned to her former instructor. Ma'am, what are you doing here? Not that I'm complaining about the timing. Commander Walsh smiled. I was having dinner with some colleagues down the street when I got a text from someone who recognized you. Word travels fast in the special operations community when one of our own is involved in a situation. Sarah looked around at the crowd, many of whom were still staring at her with mixtures of awe and curiosity. Great. So much for keeping a low profile. Oh, I don't think that was ever really an option, Commander Walsh said with a laugh. You can't hide what you are, Sarah. And, frankly, I don't think you should try. The crowd in Murphy's Tavern was slow to return to normal conversation. Sarah found herself the center of attention in a way she had never wanted or expected. People kept glancing over at her, some trying to be subtle, others openly staring. A few had approached to thank her or ask questions, which she politely deflected. Commander Walsh noticed Sarah's discomfort and guided her to a quieter corner booth. You look like you'd rather be back in Afghanistan, she observed. At least there I knew what was expected of me, Sarah replied, taking a long drink of her beer. This civilian transition thing is harder than I thought it would be. It always is. Especially for people like us. Commander Walsh settled into the booth across from her. How are you really doing, Martinez? And, don't give me the standard fine, ma'am response. Sarah considered the question seriously. Commander Walsh had been her mentor through the most difficult period of her life, and she deserved honesty. I'm struggling, she admitted. Everything feels different. The noise, the crowds, the way people look at me when they find out what I do. Sometimes I feel like I don't fit anywhere anymore. That's normal, Commander Walsh said gently. You've spent the last few years living at a level of intensity and purpose that most people never experience. Coming back to everyday life can feel like trying to wear clothes that don't fit anymore. Across the bar, Sarah noticed a young woman approach their table hesitantly. She was probably in her early 20s, with nervous eyes and a military bearing that suggested she was active duty. Excuse me, the woman said quietly. I'm sorry to bother you, but are you really a Navy SEAL? Sarah looked at Commander Walsh, who nodded slightly. Yes, I am. The young woman's face lit up. I'm Corporal Lisa Chen, Marine Corps. I just wanted to say, thank you. Not just for tonight, but for showing that it's possible. I've been thinking about trying for special operations training, but everyone tells me I'm crazy. What do you think? Sarah asked. I think they might be right, Lisa admitted with a self-deprecating laugh. But watching you tonight, maybe crazy isn't always a bad thing. Sarah smiled. The training is brutal. It's designed to break you down and rebuild you. Most people don't make it through, and that includes a lot of very tough men. If you're going to try, you need to be absolutely certain it's what you want. But, it's possible? It's possible, Sarah confirmed. Difficult, but possible. If you're serious about it, start training now. Physical fitness is just the beginning. You need mental toughness, the ability to work as part of a team, and the intelligence to adapt to constantly changing situations. Lisa nodded eagerly. Would it be okay if I contacted you sometime? For advice? Sarah glanced at Commander Walsh again, who smiled encouragingly. Sure. Commander Walsh can give you my contact information. After Lisa left, Commander Walsh leaned back in the booth. See? This is why you can't hide what you are. That young woman needed to see that tonight. She needed to know it was possible. I never wanted to be anyone's inspiration, Sarah said. I just wanted to serve my country. Sometimes those things go hand in hand. Whether you like it or not, you're a symbol now. Every woman in the military is watching to see how this experiment turns out. Sarah felt the weight of that responsibility settle on her shoulders. What if I'm not strong enough? What if I mess up and prove all the doubters right? Then, you'll deal with it and move on, Commander Walsh said firmly. But, you won't mess up because you're not wired that way. I've seen you under pressure, Sarah. Tonight was nothing compared to what you've already survived. Their conversation was interrupted by the bartender, who approached with an apologetic expression. Ladies, I hate to bother you, but there's someone here who'd like to speak with you. He gestured toward the bar's entrance, where a man in civilian clothes was waiting. Sarah immediately recognized him as law enforcement, probably military police or shore patrol, based on his bearing and the way he carried himself. Lieutenant Martinez, the man asked as he approached their table. I'm Agent Rodriguez, NCIS. I'd like to ask you a few questions about what happened here tonight. Sarah's stomach dropped. NCIS was the Naval Criminal Investigative Service, and their involvement suggested this situation might be more serious than she had realized. Am I in trouble? She asked. No, ma'am. Nothing like that. But, the incident was recorded by several witnesses, and there are procedures we need to follow when active duty personnel are involved in altercations, even justified ones. Commander Walsh spoke up. Agent Rodriguez, Lieutenant Martinez acted in self-defense after being physically assaulted. There are dozens of witnesses who can confirm that. Yes, ma'am, I understand that. And, from what I've seen so far, Lieutenant Martinez handled the situation with remarkable restraint. But, Soldier Jenkins has been transported to the base hospital with a dislocated shoulder, and his unit is asking questions. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine. I didn't mean to seriously injure him. I was just trying to control the situation. You did exactly what you should have done, Agent Rodriguez assured her. The problem is that Jenkins is claiming you used excessive force. He's saying you attacked him unprovoked. That's ridiculous, Commander Walsh said hotly. Half the bar saw him grab her first. I know, and the witness statements support that completely. But, Jenkins' commanding officer is under pressure to investigate, especially given the unusual nature of the situation. Agent Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and showed them a social media post. It was a video someone had taken of the confrontation, showing Sarah effortlessly controlling Jenkins while he struggled helplessly. The caption read, "Female Navy SEAL destroys drunk soldier who thought he was tough." The video had already been shared thousands of times, and the comments ranged from admiration to skepticism to outright hostility. Some people were celebrating Sarah as a hero, while others were questioning whether the whole thing was staged or claiming that women had no business in special operations.
This is going viral, Agent Rodriguez explained.
It's being shared across military social media groups, veteran forums, and general social media.
The story is spreading fast, and not all the reaction is positive.
Sarah scrolled through some of the comments, her heart sinking with each one. People were dissecting every aspect of the video, analyzing her technique, questioning her credentials, and debating whether women belonged in combat roles. There are already news outlets picking up the story, Agent Rodriguez continued. They're calling you the SEAL who taught a lesson to a drunk soldier.
It's becoming a national story about women in the military.
This is a nightmare, Sarah muttered. Actually, it might be an opportunity, Commander Walsh said thoughtfully. The narrative is already being written, Sarah. You can either let other people tell your story, or you can tell it yourself.
What do you mean?
I mean that this conversation about women in combat roles is happening whether you participate or not.
The question is whether you want to have a voice in that conversation, or whether you want to let others speak for you. Agent Rodriguez closed his tablet.
For now, I need you to come to the base tomorrow to give a formal statement. It's routine, and, based on the evidence I've seen, I don't expect any charges. But, we need to go through the process. After he left, Sarah sat in stunned silence. An hour ago, she had just been trying to enjoy a quiet beer. Now she was at the center of a national controversy about gender and military service. How did this get so complicated? She asked. Because you're living at the intersection of history, Commander Walsh replied. What you did tonight, what you accomplished in training, what you did during deployment, it's all part of something bigger than yourself.
That's both a burden and an opportunity.
Sarah looked around the bar, which was finally returning to something approaching normal. People were still talking about what they had witnessed, but the conversation had moved beyond the immediate drama to bigger questions about strength, gender, and what it meant to serve. I never asked for this, she said quietly. None of us ask for the roles history gives us, Commander Walsh replied. But, once we have them, we can either run from the responsibility or embrace it. You've spent your whole career proving that women can do anything men can do. Tonight, you did it in front of an audience. Sarah finished her beer and stood up. I should probably go home and figure out how to handle this. Sarah, Commander Walsh called as she started to leave. Remember that what happened tonight wasn't just about you putting some drunk bully in his place. It was about showing the world what trained, disciplined service members look like when they're forced to defend themselves and others. You represented all of us tonight, and you did it with honor. As Sarah walked out of Murphy's Tavern, she could feel the weight of eyes following her. By tomorrow, her life would be completely different. The question was whether she was ready for what came next. 3 months later, Sarah Martinez stood at the podium of the Pentagon's briefing room, looking out at an audience that included senior military leaders, members of Congress, and representatives from major news organizations. The journey from that night at Murphy's Tavern to this moment had been unlike anything she could have imagined. The viral video had indeed changed everything. Within 48 hours, it had been viewed millions of times across various platforms. News organizations had picked up the story, and, suddenly, everyone wanted to interview the female Navy SEAL who took down a drunk soldier. Sarah had initially tried to avoid the attention, giving only a brief statement through her command's public affairs office. But, the story had taken on a life of its own. Jenkins, embarrassed by his humiliation and facing potential disciplinary action, had gone to the media with his version of events, claiming he was the victim of an unprovoked assault by a woman who was probably on steroids and questioning whether women in special operations were ticking time bombs waiting to hurt innocent people. His claims had been quickly debunked by the numerous witness statements and video evidence, but they had succeeded in turning the incident into a broader debate about women in combat roles. Critics argued that Sarah's actions proved women in special operations were too aggressive and couldn't control themselves. Supporters countered that she had shown exactly the kind of restraint and professionalism that special operations demanded. The debate had reached the highest levels of government when several members of Congress demanded hearings on the integration of women into special operations forces. The Pentagon had found itself in the uncomfortable position of defending a program that was still relatively new and controversial.
Commander Walsh had been right about the opportunity.
Recognizing that the narrative was already being written about her, Sarah had made the difficult decision to speak publicly about her experiences. She had given a series of carefully planned interviews, sharing her story of growing up wanting to serve her country, the challenges of special operations training, and her deployment experiences. The response had been overwhelming. Young women across the country had reached out to her, sharing their own military aspirations. Veterans had praised her professionalism under pressure. But there had also been intense criticism from those who believed women had no place in combat roles. Now, standing at the Pentagon podium, Sarah was about to deliver what many considered the most important speech of the ongoing debate. The Secretary of Defense had asked her to present her experiences as part of a comprehensive review of the Women in Special Operations program.
"Good afternoon," Sarah began, her voice calm and clear.
"My name is Lieutenant Sarah Martinez, and I am honored to be here today to discuss my experiences as one of the first women to complete Navy SEAL training and deploy in a combat role." She had rehearsed this speech dozens of times, but, standing here now, she decided to set aside her prepared remarks and speak from the heart. 3 months ago, I was just trying to enjoy a quiet beer after returning from deployment. I never intended to become the center of a national debate. But sometimes life doesn't give us a choice about the moments that define us. She looked out at the audience, making eye contact with several senior officers she recognized. That night at Murphy's Tavern, I did what any properly trained service member should do when confronted with a situation involving harassment and assault. I used the minimum force necessary to control the situation and protect innocent people. The fact that I happened to be a woman, and that my training happened to be from one of the military's most elite programs, doesn't change the fundamental nature of what occurred. There were nods from several people in the audience, but Sarah could also see skeptical faces among the crowd. "But I understand that my presence here represents something larger than one incident in a bar. It represents a question that our military and our society are still grappling with. What role should women play in our nation's defense?" Sarah paused, thinking about all the people who had brought her to this moment. Her parents, who had supported her unconventional dreams. The instructors who had pushed her to her limits and beyond. The teammates who had trusted her with their lives in combat. And the young women like Corporal Lisa Chen, who were watching to see if it was truly possible for them to serve in any capacity they were qualified for. I can't speak for all women, just as no male service member can speak for all men. But I can tell you about my own experience. SEAL training was the hardest thing I've ever done. The physical demands pushed me beyond what I thought was possible. The mental challenges forced me to confront my deepest fears and limitations. And the teamwork requirements taught me that success in special operations isn't about individual heroics, it's about being someone your teammates can count on absolutely. She saw Commander Walsh in the audience, smiling encouragingly. During my deployment, I served alongside some of the finest soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines our country has ever produced. They didn't care whether I was male or female. They cared whether I could do my job, whether I would watch their backs, and whether I would complete the mission. And I did. Sarah's voice grew stronger as she continued. The enemy we faced didn't give us any consideration based on gender. They tried to kill us equally. And we responded with the same level of professionalism and effectiveness that special operations forces have always brought to the fight. An older general in the front row leaned forward, clearly engaged by her words. But this debate isn't really about me or about what happened that night in San Diego. It's about whether our military will be strong enough to face the challenges of the 21st century. It's about whether we will use every qualified person to defend our country, or whether we will limit ourselves based on outdated assumptions about what people can achieve. Sarah gestured toward the American flag that stood behind the podium. That flag represents the idea that in America, your potential shouldn't be limited by circumstances beyond your control. It represents the principle that if you're willing to work hard enough, sacrifice enough, and meet the standards, you should have the opportunity to serve your country in any capacity you're qualified for. The room was completely silent now, everyone hanging on her words.
I'm not asking for special treatment or lowered standards. I'm asking for the same thing every service member asks for, the opportunity to be judged by my performance, not by assumptions about my gender. The opportunity to serve my country to the fullest extent of my abilities. Sarah looked directly at several members of Congress who were in attendance. The integration of women into special operations isn't an experiment anymore. It's a reality. Women are serving, succeeding, and making our special operations forces stronger. The question isn't whether we can do the job, we've already proven that. The question is whether our military will embrace that reality or continue to fight against it. As she concluded her speech, Sarah thought about Jenkins, who had become something of a cautionary tale about the consequences of underestimating people based on appearances. He had been disciplined by his command and had largely disappeared from public view, but his initial actions had inadvertently sparked a national conversation that was long overdue. In closing, I want to say that I'm proud to wear this uniform. I'm proud of my service, my teammates, and my country. And I'm proud to be part of a military that is strong enough to evolve, to grow, and to become better than it was yesterday. The applause that followed was thunderous. Sarah saw tears in the eyes of several people in the audience, including Commander Walsh. But, more importantly, she saw understanding. The skeptical faces from earlier now showed thoughtful consideration. After the formal proceedings, Sarah was approached by dozens of people. Senior officers congratulated her on her service and her speech. Members of Congress asked detailed questions about training standards and operational effectiveness. Journalists requested follow-up interviews. But the conversation that meant the most to her came from an unexpected source. General Patricia Morrison, the highest-ranking woman in the Army, pulled Sarah aside as the crowd was dispersing. "Lieutenant Martinez," the general said, "I want you to know that what you did today, both in that bar and here in this room, will be remembered as a turning point. Not just for women in the military, but for our military as a whole." "Thank you, ma'am. I just told the truth about my experiences." "Sometimes that's the most powerful thing you can do," General Morrison replied. "You've given a voice to every woman who has ever wanted to serve but was told she couldn't, and you've reminded all of us why we serve in the first place." 6 months later, Sarah was back in Afghanistan, leading another deployment with her Special Operations Unit. The controversy had largely faded from the headlines, replaced by other stories and debates. But the changes it had sparked were permanent. The Pentagon had announced an expansion of opportunities for women in special operations, with new training programs and clearer pathways for advancement. More importantly, the conversation had shifted from whether women could serve in these roles to how the military could best utilize the talents of all qualified personnel. Sarah still got recognized occasionally, especially when she was in civilian clothes. But, increasingly, people knew her not as the female SEAL who fought a drunk soldier, but simply as Lieutenant Martinez, a professional special operator who happened to be a woman. That night at Murphy's Tavern had lasted less than 10 minutes, but its ripple effects continued to spread. Young women across the country were entering military service with new confidence that their potential wouldn't be limited by their gender. Training programs were being redesigned to better accommodate the reality of integrated special operations forces. And, slowly but steadily, the military was becoming stronger and more effective as it learned to fully utilize the talents of all Americans willing to serve. Jenkins, meanwhile, had left the military shortly after the incident. His final act of service, though unintentional, was to help demonstrate that the future of American special operations wasn't about maintaining old barriers, but about breaking them down in service of a stronger, more capable military. Sarah never saw him again, but she sometimes wondered if he understood the role he had played in advancing the very cause he had tried to oppose. His moment of aggression and poor judgment had become the catalyst for a conversation that needed to happen, led by a woman who had spent her entire career proving that courage, competence, and commitment weren't determined by gender. As Sarah looked out over the Afghan landscape from her forward operating base, she thought about all the young women who would follow in her footsteps. They would face their own challenges and obstacles, but they would also have something she hadn't had when she started, proof that it was possible. The legend that had begun that night in San Diego wasn't really about one woman's ability to defend herself against a much larger opponent.
It was about the power of preparation, the importance of standing up for others, and the truth that strength comes in many forms. Most importantly, it was about the ongoing evolution of an institution that was learning to judge its members not by who they were, but by what they could accomplish in service to their country. And, in the end, that was the most important victory of all.